The morning sun painted golden streaks across the vast Harrington ranch as Jake Dawson guided his weathered pickup truck down the dusty driveway. At 35, Jake's calloused hands and sun-worn face told the story of a man who had spent his life chasing dreams that always seemed to gallop just beyond his reach. The once promising rodeo star now worked as a hired hand, scraping by on whatever jobs the local ranchers would throw his way. Today, however, might change everything. Eleanor Harrington, the 80-year-old widow who owned the largest cattle operation in 3 counties, had specifically requested Jake for a special project. Rumor had it that her regular ranch manager had quit suddenly, leaving her in desperate need of experienced help. Just a few months of steady work, Jake muttered to himself, parking his truck beside the imposing white Victorian farmhouse that stood like a fortress overlooking the 5,000-acre spread. That's all I need to get back on my feet. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Eleanor Harrington sat regally on the wide front porch, her silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, piercing blue eyes following Jake's approach with unsettling intensity. Despite her advanced age, there was nothing frail about Eleanor. She commanded respect with merely a glance. "Mr. Dawson," she called out, her voice stronger than her years would suggest. "You're late." Jake removed his worn Stetson, clutching it against his chest. "Apologies, Mrs. Harrington. Had a flat on Route 16. Eleanor studied him for a long moment, her gaze crawling over every inch of him as if appraising livestock at auction. "They tell me you were quite the champion before. Your accident. 3-time state rodeo winner, if I recall correctly." Jake shifted uncomfortably. The rodeo circuit felt like another lifetime ago, before a bull named Widowmaker had shattered his left leg and ended his career. "Yes, ma'am. That was a while back." "And now you're broke," Eleanor stated matter-of-factly, no sympathy in her tone. "Living in that trailer park outside of town, picking up odd jobs." Heat crept up Jake's neck. "I get by all right." Eleanor's thin lips curved into what might have been a smile. "No, Mr. Dawson, you don't, but that's not my concern." She gestured to the empty chair beside her. "Sit." Jake hesitated, then obeyed, settling his lanky frame into the rocking chair. The wood creaked beneath him, breaking the tense silence. "I'll be direct," Eleanor continued, her eyes fixed on the distant mountains. "I need more than a hired hand. I need someone who understands ranching from the ground up. Someone who can make quick decisions and isn't afraid of hard work." She turned to face him. "My previous manager embezzled nearly $200,000 before disappearing. The authorities are looking for him, but meanwhile, I have 5,000 acres and 800 head of cattle requiring attention." Jake's eyes widened. "I'm sorry to hear that, Mom. That's a tough break." Eleanor waved her hand dismissively. "I've weathered worse storms in my 80 years, but this time I need to be more careful about who I trust." She paused, eyes narrowing. "The job pays $1,800 a month, plus room and board in the manager's cottage. You'd have full authority over the ranch hands and operations." Jake tried to keep his expression neutral, though his heart hammered in his chest. $1,800 a month was more than he'd made in the last 3 months combined. "There's a condition," Eleanor added, her voice taking on a peculiar edge. "What's that, Mom?" Eleanor's weathered hand suddenly covered his, her grip surprisingly strong. "You would need to marry me, Mr. Dawson." The words hung in the air between them, as impossible as snow in August. Jake was certain he'd misheard. "Excuse me?" "You heard correctly," Eleanor replied calmly. "I need a husband, not just a ranch manager, on paper at least." Jake slowly pulled his hand away, wondering if the old woman had lost her mind. "Mrs. Harrington, I don't understand." "It's quite simple," she interrupted. "I have my reasons for needing a legal husband. You need financial stability. The arrangement would be strictly business. We would maintain separate quarters. You would manage the ranch and accompany me to certain social functions. In return, you would receive the salary I mentioned, plus certain additional benefits upon my death." Jake stood abruptly, nearly knocking over the rocking chair. "Mrs. Harrington, I think I should go." Eleanor remained seated, unflustered. "My lawyer has prepared a prenuptial agreement that protects my primary assets, but guarantees you a generous stipend should I pass away. The only requirement is that the marriage lasts at least 6 months. "This is crazy," Jake muttered, jamming his hat back on his head. "I'm not some gigolo you can hire." "Don't flatter yourself, Mr. Dawson," Eleanor replied sharply. "I have no interest in your physical attributes. This arrangement is purely practical." Jake backed toward the steps. "Find someone else for your scheme." 3,000 a month, Eleanor counted, plus 10% of the ranch's quarterly profits, and I'll throw in that black quarter horse you were admiring in the south pasture. Jake froze. $3,000 would clear his debts in 2 months. By 6 months, he might even have enough saved to make a down payment on his own small spread. And that quarter horse, Midnight Runner, was the finest animal he'd seen in years. "Why me?" he finally asked. "You could hire any ranch hand in the county." Eleanor's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Because despite your current circumstances, you have a reputation for honesty. Because you understand ranching. And because, Mr. Dawson, I'm dying." The blunt declaration stunned Jake into silence. "Pancreatic cancer," Eleanor continued matter-of-factly. "The doctors give me perhaps 8 months. I intend to have my affairs in order long before then." The revelation changed everything, casting her bizarre proposal in a different light. This wasn't some rich old woman's eccentric game. It was a dying woman's final business arrangement. "I'll need to think about it," Jake said, his voice hoarse. Eleanor nodded once. "The offer stands until tomorrow noon. After that, I'll approach Dennis Myers about the position." Dennis Myers, a notorious drunk who'd run his own family ranch into the ground. The thought of Eleanor's magnificent operation in Myers' hands made Jake's stomach turn. "I'll have your answer by morning," he promised. "I expected nothing less," Eleanor replied. She reached for her walking cane and stood. "Good day, Mr. Dawson." As Jake drove away from the Harrington ranch, dust billowing behind his truck, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being pulled into something far more complicated than a business arrangement. Eleanor Harrington hadn't become the most successful, a rancher in the county by being straightforward. There was something she wasn't telling him, something beyond a marriage of convenience and a terminal diagnosis. Whatever secret Eleanor was keeping, Jake suspected he'd find out soon enough. The question was whether he'd regret discovering it. Jake's truck rattled over potholes as he pulled into Rusty's Bar and Grill, his mind spinning faster than a calf in a lasso competition. The neon sign flickered weakly against the darkening sky, matching his conflicted spirit. Inside, country music wailed from ancient speakers, while regulars hunched over their beers, escaping the relentless Texas heat. "Well, if it ain't the prodigal cowboy," called Mac, the bartender who'd been serving Jake whiskey since his first legal drink. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Jake slid onto a worn bar stool, dropping his hat beside him. "Worse. I've been offered a devil's bargain." Mac placed a glass of bourbon in front of him without being asked. "From the looks of you, I'd say this one's on the house. Spill it." "Eleanor Harrington wants to marry me," Jake said, downing half the bourbon in one swallow. The words landed like a grenade. 2 cowboys at the end of the bar swiveled their heads, and Mac dropped the glass he was polishing. "Eleanor Harrington? The Ice Queen of Triple Creek. She's got to be 80 years old," Jake finished. "Yes, I'm well aware," Mac whistled low. "Boy, What kind of trouble are you in that marrying a woman old enough to be your grandmother sounds like a solution? Jake traced the rim of his glass, the bourbon burning in his throat, matching the fire of his shame. He'd never admitted how bad things had gotten, not to Mac, not to anyone. But tonight, with Eleanor's proposal hanging over him like a thundercloud, the truth spilled out. I'm 3 months behind on lot rent. Bank's about to repossess my truck, and last week I had to choose between feeding myself or my horse. His voice dropped. Sunset's all I've got left from the old days. Couldn't let him go hungry. Mac's expression softened. Hell, Jake, why didn't you say something? And say what? That the great Jake Dawson, who once had sponsors lining up and buckles, filling his shelf, can't even afford a bag of feed. He shook his head. Pride's about the only thing I haven't had to pawn. So what exactly is the old lady offering? Jake outlined Eleanor's proposal, the salary, the quarters, the prenup, and the ticking clock of her illness. Sounds like a business. A deal with a wedding ring, Mac observed, refilling Jake's glass. But Eleanor Harrington doesn't make deals unless she's getting the better end of the bargain. What's she really after? That's what I can't figure out, Jake admitted. She says it's to have her affairs in order, but something doesn't add up. Why marriage? Why me? From a corner booth, a gravelly voice broke into their conversation. Because of the Harrington Trust, that's why. Jake turned to see Walter Griffin, a retired attorney who'd handled most of the legal matters in Triple Creek for 40 years before his son took over the practice. The old man's liver-spotted hand trembled as he raised his drink. Mind your business, Walt, Mac warned. Boy deserves to know what he's walking into, Walter replied, sliding out of his booth to join them. His eyes, though clouded with cataracts, fixed on Jake with surprising intensity. Eleanor's husband Charles set up an ironclad trust before he died. The Harrington Ranch can only pass to a family member or a spouse. If Eleanor dies without either, the whole operation goes to charity. Jake's heartbeat quickened. She mentioned family problems but didn't elaborate. Walter snorted. That's putting it mildly. Her only son, Richard, hasn't spoken to her in 20 years, lives in Europe somewhere, and her granddaughter Charlotte, wild as a March hare, ran off to California after Eleanor cut her off for dating some drug dealer. So I'm just a loophole, Jake murmured. A legal technicality so she can control who gets the ranch. Smart boy, Walter nodded. Eleanor's always 5 steps ahead. Question is, who's she planning to leave it all to if not her bloodkin? The bar door swung open, letting in a blast of hot air and the sheriff's deputy, Mason Turner. His eyes locked on Jake immediately. "Dawson!" he called, approaching with purpose in his stride. "Need a word." Jake tensed. Had someone overheard his conversation with Eleanor? Was her proposal somehow illegal? "What's this about, Mason?" "Got a call from Eleanor Harrington an hour ago," the deputy said, lowering his voice. "She claims someone's been tampering with her cattle, found 2 dead. This morning, and it wasn't natural causes." Jake frowned. "What's that got to do with me?" "She seems to think you're already working for her. Said you'd know which pastures to check." Mason's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Something you want to share, Dawson. Just interviewed for a ranch manager position today," Jake replied carefully. "Nothing official yet." Mason studied him for a long beat. "Well, official or not, she's asking for you. Says to bring your gear and plan to stay on the property tonight. Apparently there's some kind of security situation." The hairs on Jake's neck stood up. This was no coincidence. Eleanor was forcing his hand, creating a scenario where he'd have to stay at the ranch, speeding up his decision. "Tell her I'll be there in an hour," Jake finally said. After Mason left, Mac gave a low whistle. "Sounds like the old lady's not taking I need to think about it for an answer." "No," Jake agreed, draining his glass and standing. "And now I'm really wondering why." The drive back to the Harrington Ranch felt shorter this time, each mile bringing Jake closer to a decision that could change everything. The evening sky had turned the color of an old bruise, dark clouds gathering on the horizon. A storm was coming, in more ways than one. Eleanor was waiting for him in the same spot as before, as if she hadn't moved all day. Only now, Jake noticed the oxygen tank discreetly positioned beside her chair, a thin tube running to her nostrils. Her illness wasn't just a bargaining chip, it was real. "You're earlier than I expected," she said as he climbed the porch steps. "I take it Deputy Turner found you." "This cattle situation," Jake said, ignoring her observation. "Is it real, or just a way to get me back here?" Eleanor's eyes flashed. "I don't fabricate crimes, Mr. Dawson. 2 of my prize Herefords are dead, with strange injection marks on their necks. The vet is testing for poison." Jake's rancher instincts kicked in immediately. "Have you checked the other herds? Moved them to different pastures? This could spread, which is precisely why I need someone who understands what's at stake," Eleanor cut in. "The hands are loyal, but they need leadership. I can no longer ride out to the far pastures myself." For the first time, Jake noticed the pallor beneath her composed exterior, the slight tremor in her hands. The formidable Eleanor Harrington was indeed fighting a battle she couldn't win. "I know about the trust," Jake said quietly. "About the inheritance restrictions." Eleanor's expression didn't change, but something in her posture shifted. "Walter Griffin has a loose tongue when he drinks. No matter, it doesn't change the arrangement I proposed." "It changes everything," Jake countered. "You're not just hiring a ranch manager, you're choosing who gets the Harrington legacy. Why not reach out to your son, your granddaughter? Why a stranger?" Thunder rumbled in the distance, and Eleanor's gaze drifted toward the threatening sky. "Blood doesn't guarantee loyalty, Mr. Dawson. My son Richard abandoned this land long ago for European art galleries. Charlotte cares only for what the ranch can fund, namely her extravagant lifestyle and questionable choices." She turned back, to him eyes suddenly fierce. "This ranch isn't just property, it's 5 generations of Harrington sweat and sacrifice. I won't see it divided and sold off by people who never understood its value." "And you think I do?" Jake asked. "I think you're a man who recognizes what truly matters." Eleanor reached for a manila envelope on the side table. "Your decision deadline has been moved up. I need an answer tonight, before this storm breaks." Jake stared at the envelope, feeling the weight of the choice before him. "And if I say yes, what exactly do you expect from me beyond managing the ranch and playing husband at social events?" "Protecting what I've built," Eleanor replied simply, "even after I'm gone. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us." Now back to the story. Before Jake could respond, headlights swept across the front yard as a sleek black Mercedes roared up the driveway, skidding to a dramatic halt. The car door flew open and a young woman emerged, mid-20s, expensively dressed, with Eleanor's distinctive blue eyes burning in a face flushed with fury. "Grandmother!" she shouted, storming toward the porch. "What is this insanity I'm hearing about you getting married?" Eleanor's expression hardened. "Charlotte, what an unexpected surprise!" Jake felt the air between the 2 women crackle with tension as old as the hills around them. And suddenly, with Charlotte's arrival, Eleanor's urgency made perfect sense. The game had more players than he'd realized, and the stakes were higher than he'd ever imagined. Charlotte Harrington looked like she'd stepped straight from the pages of a fashion magazine. Her designer clothes and perfectly highlighted hair, a stark contrast to the rural setting. But the steel in her spine and the fire in her eyes, those were pure Harrington. "Mason's wife works at the courthouse," Charlotte spat, marching up the porch steps. "She called me the moment your lawyer filed for a marriage license. Have you completely lost your mind?" Eleanor remained unnervingly calm. I see your network of small-town gossips remains efficient. Mr. Dawson, this is my granddaughter Charlotte. Charlotte, this is Jake Dawson, my ranch manager and, potentially, my fiancé. Charlotte's gaze raked over Jake with withering assessment. So this is your latest scheme? Marrying some washed-up rodeo cowboy? What's he after, your money or your land? Neither. Jake cut in, bristling at her tone. I was offered a job, nothing more. A job that comes with a wedding ring. Charlotte laughed bitterly. Please, I know a gold digger when I see one. Eleanor tapped her cane sharply against the porch floorboards. That's quite enough, Charlotte. Mr. Dawson hasn't even accepted my proposal yet. Proposal, Charlotte echoed, her voice dripping with disdain. Is that what we're calling it? Because it sounds like exploitation to me, taking advantage of a dying old woman. I'm neither senile nor coerced, Eleanor interrupted with steel in her voice. My mind is sharper than yours on your best day, girl, and I'll thank you to remember whose house you're standing in. The first fat raindrops began to fall as the storm clouds opened, punctuating Eleanor's words with nature's own dramatic timing. Lightning flashed, illuminating the three figures on the porch in stark relief. Eleanor regal in her chair, Charlotte, vibrating with indignation, and Jake caught between them like a deer in crosshairs. Inside, Eleanor commanded, gesturing toward the door. This conversation requires privacy and perhaps stronger refreshments than iced tea. The interior of the Harrington house matched its imposing exterior. Dark wood paneling, ancestral portraits, and furniture that had witnessed a century of family dramas. Eleanor led them to a study that smelled of leather and wood polish, gesturing for Jake to close the heavy oak door behind them. Whiskey's in the cabinet, she instructed, easing herself into a leather wingback chair with a barely perceptible wince of pain. I believe we could all use a drink. Charlotte stalked to the liquor cabinet, pouring 3 fingers of bourbon without asking if anyone else wanted one. I spoke to Richard this morning, she announced, her back to them. He's flying in from Paris next week. Eleanor's face remained impassive, but Jake caught the slight tightening of her fingers on the chair's armrest. Your father hasn't set foot on this ranch in 20 years. I'm surprised he remembers the way. Amazing how news of a strange man marrying his mother can jog one's memory. Charlotte turned, swirling the amber liquid in her glass. He's bringing lawyers. As am I, Eleanor countered smoothly. Now, did you drive all the way from Austin just to make threats, or is there an actual purpose to this ambush? Charlotte's composure cracked slightly. I came to understand why you're doing this. Why now? Why him? She gestured dismissively toward Jake. You've rejected every ranch manager candidate I've suggested for years, but suddenly this random cowboy is good enough to marry. Jake shifted uncomfortably. He didn't appreciate being discussed as if he weren't in the room, but his instincts told him to observe rather than interject. There were layers to this family conflict that went far deeper than Eleanor's marriage. A proposal. Perhaps if your candidates hadn't all been former boyfriends looking for handouts, I might have considered them, Eleanor replied dryly. Mr. Dawson has actual qualifications beyond his relationship with you. Charlotte's cheeks flushed. That was uncalled for, but accurate. Eleanor's gaze shifted to Jake. Mr. Dawson, would you be kind enough to check that the horses in the south stable are properly secured for the storm? Charlotte and I need a moment alone. It was a clear dismissal, but Jake hesitated. I haven't given you my answer yet. I'm aware, Eleanor said, something like amusement flickering in her eyes. But judging by the fact you returned despite your reservations, I suspect you're leaning toward acceptance. Now please give us the room. Outside, the rain had intensified, but Jake barely noticed the downpour as he made his way to the stables. His thoughts were a tangled mess. Charlotte's unexpected arrival had changed the dynamic entirely. Whatever, Game Eleanor was playing had higher stakes than he'd initially realized. The south stable was warm and dry, the horses nickering softly as wind rattled the building's walls. Jake moved from stall to stall, checking latches and water buckets, the familiar routine calming his churning thoughts. "She's using you, you know." Jake turned to find Charlotte standing in the doorway, rain glistening on her leather jacket. "He followed him. Your grandmother sent you to check on me?" he asked, continuing his task. "My grandmother thinks I'm freshening up in my old room." Charlotte stepped inside, shaking raindrops from her hair. "I wanted to talk to you alone. Man, so to speak. I'm listening." Charlotte approached, studying him with calculated intensity. Up close, Jake could see the family resemblance to Eleanor more clearly. Same determined jaw, same regal posture. But where Eleanor's eyes held wisdom, Charlotte's blazed with something more volatile. "Whatever she's offering you, I'll double it," she said bluntly. "Walk away, forget this ridiculous marriage scheme, and I'll write you a check right now." Jake's eyebrows rose. "Just like that? Without even knowing what she offered?" "I know my grandmother. She drives hard bargains, but never overpays." Charlotte knew. Crossed her arms. $20,000, cash, tonight. The figure hung in the air between them. 20,000 would clear Jake's debts with plenty left over. More than 6 months at Eleanor's proposed salary. But something about the offer felt wrong. Too easy. "Why do you care so much?" he asked, instead of answering. "From what I gather, you haven't exactly been a fixture around here lately." Charlotte's expression darkened. "This ranch is my birthright, my legacy. I won't have her giving it away to some stranger just to spite me and my father." "She mentioned she's dying," Jake said quietly. "She's been dying for years," Charlotte countered with air quotes. "Grandmother has a flair for the dramatic. Cancer, heart problems. Every time Dad or I cross her, suddenly she's on death's door." The casual dismissal of Eleanor's illness sent a chill through Jake. He remembered the oxygen tank, the tremor in Eleanor's hands that she tried so hard to hide. "You think she's faking pancreatic cancer?" Something flickered across Charlotte's face. Uncertainty, perhaps, or a flicker of guilt. "I think she's manipulating you, just like she manipulates everyone. The question is why? What does she gain by marrying you that she couldn't accomplish with just hiring you?" The same question had been gnawing at Jake. Walter Griffin's explanation about the trust seemed plausible, but Charlotte's intensity suggested there was more at stake. "Maybe she just wants someone trustworthy running things when she's gone," Jake suggested, watching Charlotte's reaction carefully. Charlotte laughed, the sound sharp and humorless. "Trustworthy? She met you yesterday. No, this is about the will. It has to be. The will. Grandfather's will stipulated that if grandmother remarries, certain provisions change." Charlotte paced between the stalls, agitated. "I was too young to understand all the details when he died, but I know it involves voting shares in Harrington Oil." The pieces clicked into place. The Harrington wealth went beyond the ranch. The family had oil interests dating back to the early Texas boom. "This isn't about the ranch at all," Jake realized. "It's about control of the company." "The ranch is just land," Charlotte confirmed. "Valuable land, but nothing compared to the oil holdings. Grandmother's been battling the board for years. They want to sell to a larger corporation. She refuses." She stopped pacing, fixing Jake with an intense stare. "Whatever she's planning, it involves you having some kind of power after she's gone. Power she doesn't want in our family's hands." Thunder crashed overhead, making the horses stamp nervously. In their stalls, Jake stroked Midnight Runner's nose, the black quarter horse Eleanor had mentioned as part of their deal. 30,000, Charlotte said suddenly. "Final offer. Take it and disappear, or I guarantee you'll regret getting involved." In Harrington family matters, before Jake could respond, the stable door banged open again. Eleanor stood framed in the doorway, her small figure somehow commanding, despite the oxygen canister she now openly carried. "I see my granddaughter has made her counter-proposal," she remarked, her voice dangerously quiet. "Did she mention that? The money she's offering comes from the trust fund I established for her. The same fund she's nearly depleted on failed fashion boutiques and equally failed relationships." Charlotte's face contorted with anger. "That's not fair. Life rarely is," Eleanor cut her off. "Mr. Dawson, I believe it's time for your decision. My offer stands as presented this morning with one amendment. The wedding would need to take place immediately. Tomorrow, in fact." "Tomorrow?" Jake echoed, stunned by the accelerated timeline. "Circumstances have changed," Eleanor said, glancing meaningfully at Charlotte. "Time is of the essence." The storm raged around the stable, wind howling through the rafters like restless spirits. 3 people bound by circumstance, each with their own agenda, each keeping secrets. "You don't have to do this," Charlotte told Jake, desperation creeping into her voice. "Once you're tangled in her web, there's no getting out." Eleanor stepped further into the stable, her expression softening as she looked at Jake. "I told you I need someone who understands what matters, Mr. Dawson, someone who values legacy over short-term gain. The choice is yours, the choice." As if marrying an 80-year-old dying woman for money and mysterious power was a legitimate option for a down-on-his-luck cowboy. Yet as Jake looked between the 2 Harrington women, he realized he'd already made his decision, not based on Charlotte's warnings or Eleanor's promises, but on his own desperate need to belong to something bigger than himself. "If we do this," he said slowly, turning to Eleanor, "I want everything in writing, every promise, every expectation. No surprises after the ceremony." Eleanor's eyes gleamed with triumph. "My lawyer already has the paperwork prepared." Charlotte made a sound of disbelief. "You can't be serious. You don't even know what you're agreeing to." But Jake did know, at least partly. He was agreeing to step into a family war that had raged for decades. He was choosing sides in a battle whose full scope he couldn't yet see. And deep down, as lightning illuminated the tableau of the 3 of them in the ancient stable, he suspected he was making a deal that would either save him or destroy him completely. Morning arrived with cruel brightness, the storm having scrubbed the sky to a perfect mocking blue. Jake stood before the small mirror in the ranch manager's cottage, fumbling with a borrowed tie. The face that stared back at him, unshaven, dark circles underscoring bloodshot eyes, looked like a man heading to his execution rather than his wedding. After Charlotte's stormy exit last night, Eleanor had calmly handed him the keys to the cottage and a manila envelope thick with legal documents. He'd spent hours poring over the prenuptial agreement, the amended will, the power of attorney forms, all written in impenetrable legalese that made his head throb. By dawn, he understood just enough to know he was stepping into quicksand. Knock at the door interrupted his 3rd attempt at the tie. "Decent," called a gruff voice. "Depends who you ask," Jake muttered, opening the door to find Hank Wilcox, Eleanor's weathered foreman, standing on the porch. The old cowhand's face was a topographical map of years spent under the Texas sun, his expression impossible to read. "Mrs. Harrington sent this." Hank thrust a small box into Jake's hands. "Said you'd need it for the ceremony." Inside nestled a platinum wedding band, simple and masculine, not a loner or a prop, but brand new, sized precisely for Jake's finger. The sight of it made his stomach clench. "How long you been working this ranch, Hank?" Jake asked, still staring at the ring. 37 years. Pride and something like defensiveness edged Hank's voice. "Started when Mr. Charles was still alive." "And what do you make of all this?" Jake gestured vaguely, encompassing the cottage. The ring, the absurdity of the situation. Hank's leathery face remained impassive. "Not my place to judge. Mrs. Harrington built this place up after Mr. Charles died, got more spine than most men I know." He paused, eyes narrowing slightly. Question is, what are you making of it? The directness caught Jake off guard. Honestly, I don't know what I've walked into, but I do know ranching, and I know this place deserves someone who'll fight for it. Something in Hank's posture eased marginally. Judge Parker'll be here at noon. Mrs. Harrington doesn't like to be kept waiting. He turned to leave, then hesitated. Word of advice? Whatever game the Harringtons are playing, remember you're just a pawn. Don't start thinking you're a knight. The brutal assessment lingered in the air long after Hank departed. Jake finished dressing mechanically, his mind racing through escape scenarios. He could still drive away, forget the money, forget Eleanor's proposition. Charlotte would likely make good on her offer if it meant stopping the wedding. But every time his resolve flickered, he remembered the quiet dignity with which Eleanor carried her illness, the passion in her voice when she spoke of the ranch's legacy, and selfishly, pathetically, he remembered the feeling of purpose that had surged through him when she'd asked for his help. At 11:30, he walked to the main house. The sprawling Victorian had been transformed overnight. Fresh flowers adorned the porch, a small archway stood in the garden, and several ranch hands milled about in clean shirts, looking as uncomfortable as Jake felt. Deputy Turner intercepted him at the garden gate. Dawson, he greeted, suspicion still evident in his tone. Quite the whirlwind romance. Mason, Jake nodded. Don't suppose congratulations are in order? That depends. The deputy lowered his voice. Charlotte Harrington filed a complaint this morning, claims Eleanor's being coerced, that you're taking advantage of a sick woman. Ice trickled down Jake's spine. That why you're here? To stop the wedding? I'm here because I was invited. Mason replied evenly. Judge Parker's known Eleanor for 40 years. If he thinks she's being manipulated, this stops before it starts. His hand rested meaningfully on his service weapon. Just so we're clear. Before Jake could respond, a black town car pulled up the driveway. Henry Griffin, Walter's son and Eleanor's attorney, emerged, looking harried. He spotted Jake and hurried over, clutching a leather portfolio. Mr. Dawson, a moment? He steered Jake away from the deputy, his smile strained. There's been a small amendment to the agreement you reviewed last night. Jake's jaw tightened. What kind of amendment? Mrs. Harrington wants to add a confidentiality clause. Anything you learn about family matters, business holdings, or personal affairs remains strictly private. Violation would void all financial benefits. Henry extracted a document from his portfolio. If you could just initial here, I want to speak with Eleanor first, Jake interrupted, a flicker of anger rising through his apprehension. Alone, Henry hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. She's in the sunroom, but the judge arrives in 20 minutes, and everything must be signed before the ceremony. The sunroom occupied the east wing of the house, a glass-enclosed sanctuary filled with orchids and ferns. Eleanor sat in a wicker chair, resplendent in a cream-colored suit that softened the severity of her appearance. Her oxygen tank was nowhere in sight, though Jake noticed a slight bluish tint to her lips. Having second thoughts, Mr. Dawson? She asked without preamble. Shouldn't I be? Jake approached slowly. Your lawyer's suddenly adding clauses, your granddaughter's filed coercion charges, and I still don't know what happens to this ranch after you're gone. Eleanor's thin lips curved in what might have been amusement. You've had less than 24 hours to consider a life-altering proposition. Second thoughts would be the only rational response. She gestured to the chair opposite hers. Sit. We have a few minutes before the circus begins. Jake remained standing. Charlotte mentioned Harrington Oil, voting shares, a provision in your late husband's will that changes if you remarry. Is that what this is really about? A flash of admiration crossed Eleanor's face. My granddaughter has never understood the virtue of discretion. She sighed, adjusting her position with a barely perceptible wince. Yes, Charles's will includes a stipulation that if I remarry, 40% of the voting shares in Harrington Oil transfer to my new spouse upon my death. The magnitude of this revelation staggered Jake. That's insane. Why would he include such a provision? Because my husband knew me better than anyone. Eleanor's gaze drifted to the garden beyond the glass walls. He knew I would never remarry for love after him. If I took another husband, it would be for strategy, for the good of what we built together. Her eyes refocused on Jake with laser intensity. Charles believed that whoever earned my trust enough to wear his ring would deserve a voice in the company's future. And you trust me, a man you met 2 days ago? I trust your circumstances, Mr. Dawson. Eleanor's voice carried no sentimentality. You're desperate enough to accept my terms, but principled enough to question them. You understand land and legacy. And most importantly, you have no prior loyalties to the vultures circling Harrington Oil. Jake shook his head in disbelief. So I'd control nearly half the company after you're gone? That's worth millions, billions maybe. The shares would make you influential, not controlling, Eleanor corrected. And they come with strict conditions, which Mr. Griffin is no doubt eager to explain in excruciating detail. She leaned forward slightly. But before we proceed, I need your answer. To one question, what would you do with that influence? Would you vote to sell to Meridian Energy, as the board wants? Or would you protect what the Harringtons have built? The question hung between them. Weighted with decades of family history, Jake couldn't possibly understand. Yet something in Eleanor's unwavering gaze demanded honesty. I've spent my life watching small operations get swallowed by corporations, he said slowly. Watched good land mismanaged by people who've never worked it, who see only dollar signs instead of legacy. I wouldn't let that happen here. Eleanor studied him for a long, silent moment, as if searching for dishonesty. Finally, she nodded once. Then let's make you a Harrington, Mr. Dawson. The ceremony itself was surreal in its brevity. Judge Parker, a bullfrog of a man with skeptical eyes, conducted the proceedings with business-like efficiency. Only a handful of witnesses attended. Hank and a few senior ranch hands, Henry Griffin documenting everything, and Deputy Turner watching from the sidelines. By the power vested in me by the state of Texas, I pronounce you husband and wife, Judge Parker declared, his tone suggesting he was granting a fishing license rather than creating a marriage. You may, well, I suppose a handshake would suffice. Eleanor extended her hand regally, and Jake accepted it, feeling the fragile bones beneath paper-thin skin. Her grip, however, remained surprisingly strong. Congratulations, Mr. Harrington, she said, the faintest trace of irony coloring her voice. The name's still Dawson, Jake replied automatically. Not according to this. Henry Griffin appeared at their side, presenting a final document, a name change application already filled out. Mrs. Harrington requested this be prepared as well. Jake Dawson becomes Jake Harrington, effective immediately upon filing. Jake stared at the paper, a wave of vertigo washing over him. He was no longer just accepting a job or even a marriage of convenience. Eleanor was erasing him, rewriting his identity to suit her purposes. This wasn't part of our agreement, he said quietly. Consider it an addendum, Eleanor replied smoothly. The board will take you more seriously as a Harrington. It's merely practical. Before Jake could argue further, a commotion erupted at the garden entrance. Charlotte had returned, accompanied by a tall, distinguished man whose bearing screamed old money. Richard Harrington had finally come home. Am I too late to give away the bride? Richard's cultured voice dripped with sarcasm. How unfortunate. To miss my own mother's wedding. Eleanor's posture stiffened, the only indication that her son's arrival had affected her. Richard, what an unexpected journey from your galleries in Paris, touching that you could tear yourself away from your precious art collection. Richard's smile didn't reach his eyes. "When my daughter called about your creative interpretation of father's will, I felt a family reunion was overdue." His gaze shifted to Jake, assessing and dismissive in a single glance. "So this is the fortunate groom. Charming? Did he come with the livestock, or did you acquire him separately?" Jake felt his jaw tighten, but Eleanor's subtle headshake warned him to stay silent. "The ceremony is concluded, the paperwork filed," Eleanor stated coolly. "Your presence, while dramatic, changes nothing." "We'll see about that." Richard produced a folded document from his jacket pocket. "My attorneys have prepared an injunction. We're challenging the validity of this marriage on grounds of undue influence and diminished capacity." Judge Parker, who had been observing the family drama with evident discomfort, cleared his throat. "As the officiant, I can attest that Mrs. Harrington displayed full mental faculty and entered this union of her own free will." "With respect, Your Honor," Richard countered, "my mother is terminally ill, on medication, and has known this man for less than 48 hours. There's clearly something improper occurring." The accusation hung in the air, and Jake felt the weight of every gaze, suspicious, curious, judgmental. In their eyes, he was exactly what Richard claimed, an opportunist taking advantage of a dying woman's vulnerability. Eleanor's voice cut through the tension like a steel blade. "My illness affects my body, not my mind, Richard. And if time were the measure of trustworthiness, you'd have forfeited any claim to my confidence decades ago." She turned to Henry Griffin. "The papers transferring management authority to my husband are prepared." The attorney nodded, producing another document from his seemingly bottomless portfolio. "Wait!" Jake interrupted, the situation spiraling beyond his control. "I haven't agreed to a name change or immediate management transfer. We need to discuss." "What you need," Charlotte interjected, "is a reality check. She's using you as a pawn in a game that's been running longer than you've been alive." Deputy Turner stepped forward, his expression troubled. "Maybe we should all take a moment to—" He never finished the sentence. Eleanor suddenly gasped, her hand flying to her chest. For one terrible moment, Jake thought she was faking distress to end the confrontation, until he saw the genuine panic in her eyes as she began to collapse. Jake moved instinctively, catching her before she hit the ground. Her body felt impossibly light in his arms, a hollow bird with failing wings. "Get the doctor," he shouted, lowering her gently to the grass. "She can't breathe." As chaos erupted around them, Charlotte frozen in shock, Richard barking contradictory orders, Henry frantically dialing his phone. Eleanor's fingers clutched Jake's sleeve with surprising strength. She pulled him closer, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "The will," she whispered, the words barely audible. "Safe. Behind. Painting. Study." Her eyes, fierce despite her failing body, locked with his. "Trust no one, not even family." Her grip slackened as unconsciousness claimed her, leaving Jake kneeling in the grass, cradling his wife of less than 5 minutes. A stranger whose secrets might now die with her. And somewhere in the confusion, with medical personnel rushing in and accusations flying, Jake realized with grim certainty that he had just inherited a target on his back. The Triple Creek Medical Center resembled a fortress under siege. News of Eleanor Harrington's collapse had spread through the county like wildfire, drawing reporters, curious locals, and business associates who materialized with suspicious promptness. The small hospital's waiting room had become a battleground of whispers and sidelong glances, with the Harrington name on every pair of lips. Jake sat alone in a corner, still wearing his wedding clothes, now rumpled and grass-stained from catching. Eleanor. 4 hours had passed since the ambulance had screamed away from the ranch, carrying his unconscious bride. 4 hours of doctors speaking in hushed tones about critical condition and organ failure. 4 hours of Richard and Charlotte huddled with their lawyers, occasionally casting venomous glances his way. Coffee? Jake looked up to find Hank offering a styrofoam cup. The foreman's weathered face revealed nothing, but the gesture itself spoke volumes. Thanks. Jake accepted the bitter hospital brew, the warmth seeping into his cold fingers. Any update? Hank shook his head. Doctor's in with her now, but... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Eleanor's odds of leaving the hospital weren't good. The ranch, Jake asked, keeping his voice low. Hands are taking care of things. Cattle still need feeding, sick or not. Hank's gaze drifted to Richard and Charlotte, though some vultures are already circling. The elevator doors opened, and Dr. Patel emerged, looking exhausted. Richard immediately intercepted her, Charlotte hovering at his elbow. Jake rose but kept his distance, aware of his tenuous position in this family hierarchy. Mrs. Harrington is stabilized but remains in critical condition, Dr. Patel explained, her voice clinical yet compassionate. The cancer has metastasized more aggressively than our last scans indicated. Her liver is showing signs of failure, and the cardiac event was significant. Will she regain consciousness? Richard asked, his aristocratic facade cracking slightly. It's possible, but I can't promise anything. The next 24 hours are crucial. Dr. Patel glanced around the crowded waiting room. I'd suggest family members consider saying their goodbyes, just in case. The words landed like stones dropping into a still pond, ripples of reaction spreading outward. Charlotte turned away, her shoulders tight. Richard's jaw clenched, and Jake felt a confusing tangle of emotions he couldn't name. I'll see her first, Richard declared, straightening his expensive suit jacket. Charlotte, you'll follow. Then we can discuss what happens next. His gaze deliberately excluded Jake from these plans. Mr. Harrington should be allowed to see his wife, Dr. Patel corrected, checking her clipboard. Our records show Mrs. Eleanor Harrington updated her next of kin paperwork this morning. Her husband has priority visitation. Richard's face darkened. This man is not family. The marriage was a sham performed under duress, which was legally officiated and registered, Henry Griffin interjected, appearing at Jake's side like a particularly determined guardian angel. As Mrs. Harrington's attorney, I can confirm that she was of sound mind when she designated Mr. Dawson, Mr. Harrington, as her primary medical proxy. Jake felt the weight of this new revelation like a yoke across his shoulders. Not just husband, but medical decision-maker. Not just inheritor, but potentially executioner in the family's eyes. I'd like to see her, he said quietly, ignoring Richard's outrage. Alone, please. Dr. Patel nodded, gesturing toward the ICU doors. As Jake followed, he heard Richard's controlled voice. This isn't over, not by a long shot. The intensive care unit hummed with machinery, keeping the threads of life intact for its occupants. Eleanor lay in the last bed, surrounded by monitors and tubes, her formidable presence diminished by the clinical setting. Without her imperious posture and commanding gaze, she looked every day of her 80 years and more. Jake approached hesitantly, unsure of the protocol for a deathbed vigil with someone who was essentially a stranger. He settled for sitting, in the chair beside her, watching the unsteady rise and fall of her chest. You've caused quite the commotion out there, he said softly, surprising himself by speaking at all. Your son looks ready to have me drawn and quartered. Eleanor remained still, only the beeping monitors responding to his words. I don't understand any of this, Jake continued, his voice low. Why me? Why the rush? There must have been a dozen better candidates in your social circle. He leaned closer, studying her pale face. What's in that that's worth all this drama? A nurse appeared, checking Eleanor's vitals with efficient movements. Family? She asked. The question shouldn't have been complicated. Husband? Jake replied, the word foreign on his tongue. The nurse nodded sympathetically. The doctor says it could go either way. Sometimes talking helps, even if they can't respond. The hearing is often the last to go. After she left, Jake sat in silence, wrestling with implications. If Eleanor died tonight, he'd become a widower before he'd even been a real husband. He'd inherit what exactly? Voting shares in a company he knew nothing about? A ranch he had no legal claim to? Enemies he'd never asked for? "This wasn't the deal," he murmured, a hint of accusation in his tone. "You were supposed to have months, not minutes." The steady rhythm of the heart monitor was his only answer. Jake stood abruptly. "I need to find that will." Eleanor's cryptic instructions safe behind painting study might be his only roadmap through the minefield ahead. If he could discover what she'd truly intended, perhaps he could navigate this impossible situation with his conscience intact. In the waiting room, Richard and Charlotte had vanished, presumably summoned by their attorneys to strategize. Only Henry Griffin remained, his professional composure fraying at the edges. "I need to return to the ranch," Jake told him. "There are documents I need to locate." Henry's eyebrows rose fractionally. "Mrs. Harrington mentioned something to that effect. I should accompany you." At Jake's hesitation, he added, "As a witness, given the contentious nature of the situation, you shouldn't be alone when accessing any of Eleanor's personal effects." The attorney's reasoning was sound, but Jake recalled Eleanor's final warning: trust no one, not even family. Did that extend to her lawyer? "All right," Jake agreed reluctantly, "but we need to hurry." The sun was setting as they drove back to the Harrington Ranch, painting the landscape in bloody hues that matched Jake's mood. The property looked different somehow, no longer an opportunity but a labyrinth he'd foolishly entered without a thread to guide him back out. The house stood silent and watchful, the remnants of the aborted wedding celebration still scattered across the garden. Hank had sent the hands back to their regular duties, and the property felt eerily deserted. "The study's this way," Henry directed, leading Jake through the house with the familiarity of decades' acquaintance. Mrs. Harrington spent most of her time there after Mr. Charles passed. Said she felt closer to him among his books. The study was exactly as Jake remembered from his brief visit. Dark wood, leather-bound books, the lingering scent of Eleanor's subtle perfume. Several paintings adorned the walls, all landscapes except for a formal portrait of Charles Harrington above the fireplace. "Which painting?" Jake muttered, scanning the room. Henry frowned. "I beg your pardon." Jake realized his mistake immediately. If Eleanor had hidden her will behind a painting, she clearly hadn't shared that information with her attorney. "Just admiring the artwork," he improvised. "Eleanor mentioned Charles was a collector." "Ah, yes." Henry relaxed slightly. "Mr. Harrington had quite the eye for Western art. That Russell over there is worth a small fortune alone." Jake approached. The painting in question, a dramatic scene of cowboys driving cattle through a mountain pass. It hung perfectly straight, with no indication of being regularly moved. He shifted his attention to the others, looking for any sign of recent disturbance. "What exactly are we looking for?" Henry asked, his professional patience wearing thin. "Eleanor mentioned some personal papers," Jake hedged. "Something she wanted me to have if things went badly." Henry's expression softened with understanding. "Mrs. Harrington has always been thorough in her contingency planning." He moved to the massive mahogany desk, opening drawers systematically. "Perhaps in here?" While the attorney searched the desk, Jake continued studying the paintings. The portrait of Charles caught his attention, not the stern-faced man himself, but the background. Behind Charles stood a younger Eleanor, and behind her, barely visible in the shadowed background, hung another painting within the painting. A small landscape of a creek cutting through rugged hills. Jake's gaze darted around the room until he found it, an identical landscape, modest compared to the other artwork, hanging beside a bookcase. Unlike the others, this painting hung at a slight angle, as if recently disturbed. He crossed to it casually, positioning himself to block Henry's view, and carefully lifted the frame. Nothing behind it but smooth wall. Jake felt a rush of disappointment, until his fingers detected a slight depression in the wallpaper. Pressing gently, he felt something give with a soft click. The section of wall swung inward on concealed hinges, revealing a small wall safe. "Find something?" Henry called, looking up from the desk. Jake's mind raced. Just straightening this painting, it was crooked. "Mrs. Harrington always noticed things like that," Henry remarked, returning to his search. "Nothing out of place was her motto." The safe required a combination. 3 numbers Jake couldn't possibly know. Or could he? Eleanor had chosen him for specific reasons. Would she have anticipated this moment? Jake thought back to their conversations, searching for clues. His gaze fell on the painting itself, the creek landscape. In the bottom corner, nearly invisible unless you were looking for it, was a tiny inscription: Triple Creek, 1944, Triple Creek, the town's name and the year Eleanor was born. Quietly, Jake tried the combination, 319 to 44. The safe remained locked. He tried again, 31944. Nothing then. A thought struck him. Charles had established the trust. Perhaps the combination honored him instead. Jake had noticed a small plaque on Charles's desk. Charles William Harrington, 1937 to 2015. Jake tried again, 19327. The safe clicked open. Inside lay a single envelope sealed with wax impressed with the Harrington crest. Jake's name, his original name, Jake Dawson, was written across the front in Eleanor's elegant script. His heart pounding, Jake slipped the envelope inside his jacket just as Henry turned around. "Nothing in the desk that seems relevant," the attorney sighed. "Perhaps Mrs. Harrington was referring to documents at my office. I have her full legal portfolio there." "Maybe," Jake agreed, careful to keep his expression neutral. "We should head back to the hospital. I want to be there when she wakes up." The drive back to Triple Creek passed in tense silence, the envelope burning against Jake's chest like a brand. He was desperate to read its contents, but couldn't risk opening it in Henry's presence. Whatever Eleanor had hidden from her attorney, her family, and perhaps the world, Jake needed to understand it before making his next move. At the hospital, they found the situation dramatically changed. Dr. Patel met them at the elevator, her expression grave, but her eyes holding a spark of amazement. "Mr. Harrington," she addressed Jake, "your wife is awake. It's quite remarkable given her condition, but she's lucid and asking for you." Relief washed over Jake, followed immediately by uncertainty. What did one say to a near stranger who was also one's dying wife? "There's something else," Dr. Patel continued, lowering her voice. "Mrs. Harrington has requested immediate transfer to Houston Memorial. She's invoked her right to seek treatment elsewhere, and she wants to leave tonight. Her son is objecting strenuously." Jake could imagine. Houston was nearly 4 hours away, far from Richard and Charlotte's influence, and home to one of the nation's top cancer centers. "If that's what she wants," Jake said, "then that's what she'll get." Richard's voice boomed down the corridor before Jake could reach Eleanor's room. "This is medical kidnapping. She's not in her right mind." Dr. Patel's jaw tightened. "Mr. Harrington, Richard, your mother scored perfectly on our cognitive assessment. She's weak but entirely competent to make her own decisions, which she's delegated to him." Richard jabbed a finger toward Jake, this stranger who appeared out of nowhere 2 days ago. Jake stepped forward, summoning a calm he didn't feel. "Dr. Patel, please arrange the transfer as my wife requested." "Richard, I understand. You're upset, but this is Eleanor's choice." "You don't understand anything," Richard snarled, his composure finally shattering. 40 years I've protected the Harrington legacy. 40 years watching her drive away anyone who challenged her iron control. And now she hands everything to you? A nobody who couldn't even manage his own mediocre rodeo career? The personal attack landed like a physical blow, but Jake refused to flinch. This isn't about me. It's about respecting Eleanor's wishes. Her wishes? You think you know her wishes? Richard's laugh held no humor. You don't even know what you've married into. The Harrington fortune isn't just some cattle and oil shares. It's blood money. It's... Richard. Charlotte appeared beside her father, her expression alarmed. Not here, but Richard was beyond caution now, years of resentment boiling over. She'll take her secrets to the grave, and you'll be left holding the bag when it all comes crashing down. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. Did she tell you about the Apache land, about what grandfather did to secure those oil rights? Did she tell you about the bodies, Cowboy? Jake felt ice spread through his veins. What are you talking about? Richard, enough, Charlotte hissed, physically pulling her father back. This isn't helping, Mother. Through the open door of the ICU, Jake caught a glimpse of Eleanor watching the confrontation, her eyes alert, despite her frail state. Even now, she was calculating, observing, planning her next move. Get out of my way, Jake told Richard quietly. Your mother needs me. She needs a priest more than she needs you, Richard retorted. But he stepped aside, his anger cooling into something more controlled and more dangerous. Go on, play the devoted husband, but remember, Cowboy, Harringtons protect their own. Always have, always will. The threat hung in the air as Jake entered Eleanor's room, the envelope heavy against his chest. Whatever secrets it contained, he was beginning to suspect they were darker than he'd imagined. Eleanor's pale blue eyes followed him as he approached her bedside. Despite the tubes and monitors, she managed to project an aura of command from her hospital bed. You found it, she stated, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake nodded, touching his jacket where the envelope lay hidden. Haven't read it yet. Good. Eleanor's lips curved in a ghost of her former smile. Some revelations require privacy. Her gaze shifted to the door, where hospital staff were preparing for her transfer. Houston will be safer for both of us. What did Richard mean? Jake couldn't stop himself from asking. About Apache land and bodies. Eleanor's expression hardened. My son has always had a flair for dramatic exaggeration. The Harrington history, like most fortunes built in that era, has its complexities. Complexities, Jake repeated. Is that what we're calling it? What we call it, Eleanor replied with sudden sharpness, is irrelevant. What matters is what we do about it now. Her thin fingers clutched at his sleeve. I chose you because you understand value beyond money, because you can see the difference between atonement and erasure. Before Jake could demand clarification, the transfer team entered, led by Dr. Patel. We're ready, Mrs. Harrington. The helicopter is standing by. Helicopter? Jake echoed. Fastest way to Houston, Dr. Patel explained. Mrs. Harrington has arranged everything. Of course she had. Even at death's door, Eleanor Harrington controlled every detail. As the medical team prepared her for transport, Eleanor beckoned Jake closer. Whatever you read in that letter, she whispered, her breath warm against his ear. Remember that redemption sometimes requires sacrifice. The past cannot be changed, but the future isn't written yet. The cryptic statement left Jake more confused than ever. As Eleanor was wheeled toward the waiting helicopter, he felt the weight of the envelope, like a ticking bomb. Whatever confession or revelation it contained had driven a wedge between Eleanor and her son, had possibly motivated her desperate marriage arrangements, and might explain why she'd chosen Jake, an outsider with nothing to lose and everything to gain, as her final confidant. Standing in the hospital parking lot, watching the helicopter lift his bride of less than 12 hours into the night sky, Jake finally pulled out the envelope. The wax seal broke with a satisfying crack, and he unfolded a single sheet of Eleanor's monogrammed stationery. The message was brief, written in Eleanor's elegant hand. Jake. If you're reading this, circumstances have accelerated beyond my planning. The full will is with my private attorney in Houston, not with Henry Griffin. What I've told you about the Harrington oil shares is true, but incomplete. The real inheritance is detailed in documents you'll find in a lockbox at First National Bank in Houston. The key is taped beneath the saddle of your quarter horse, Midnight Runner. Richard and Charlotte cannot be allowed access to these documents under any circumstances. They would destroy them to protect the family name, but some sins demand acknowledgement rather than concealment. I have 1 week to live, perhaps less. In that time, I must prepare you for the burden I've placed on your shoulders. It is heavier than you know, but I believe you are strong enough to bear it. Eleanor. P.S. The cattle were poisoned deliberately. Trust no one at the ranch except Hank. He alone knows the full truth. Jake read the letter twice, then a third time, the implications sinking in with each reading. This wasn't just about inheritance or company control. This was about secrets, possibly criminal secrets, buried in the Harrington past. Secrets someone was willing to kill for, starting with the cattle. And now, as Eleanor's husband and heir, those secrets and that danger belonged to Jake. His phone vibrated with an incoming text from an unknown number. Midnight Runner is missing from the stables. Richard's men are searching your cottage. Get somewhere safe. Hank. Jake crumpled the letter in his fist, cold certainty washing over him. The game had changed. Eleanor had made him the keeper of whatever damning legacy the Harringtons had buried, and now someone was determined to silence him before he could uncover it. The key to everything was with a horse that had just been stolen, and somewhere in the gathering, Texas night, the truth waited, alongside whoever was desperate enough to kill to protect it. Rain began to fall as Jake gunned his truck down the hospital access road, each drop an urgent drumbeat against the windshield. The old pickup groaned under his demands, but Jake pushed harder, knowing seconds might make the difference between life and death, his own. Hank's warning pulsed through his mind. Richard's men searching his cottage, Midnight Runner missing, the key gone. His tenuous claim to Eleanor's secrets in jeopardy before he'd even understood what those secrets were. Jake took a hard right, avoiding the main highway back to the ranch. Instead, he cut down a series of unmarked county roads, using old ranch shortcuts known only to locals. If Richard had men looking for him, they'd watch the obvious routes. His phone buzzed again. Hank, they've found Eleanor's letter in your cottage. Richard is furious. Claims you've stolen family documents. So they'd already searched his temporary home, violating what little privacy he'd had. Jake's jaw tightened. Richard wasn't just trying to stop him. He was building a case against him. Theft, fraud, elder, abuse. The accusations would pile up until Jake was buried beneath them. Another text followed. Charlotte asking questions about Houston. Watch your back. Jake's hands clenched the steering wheel. He needed to reach Houston and Eleanor, but first, he needed that key, which meant finding Midnight Runner. The ranch had dozens of outbuildings, old line shacks, and secondary pastures where a horse could be hidden. But if someone had taken the animal to prevent Jake from accessing the lockbox, they'd keep the horse. Close enough to guard, but far enough to avoid immediate discovery. Jake's mind raced through possibilities until one location crystallized, the abandoned Harrington hunting cabin near the creek that gave Triple Creek its name. Isolated, accessible, only by a rugged trail yet still on Harrington land. The perfect hiding place. He swung the truck onto a rutted path that disappeared into dense mesquite, the undercarriage scraping against rocks and roots. After half a mile, the trail became impassable. Jake grabbed his flashlight and continued. On foot, rain plastering his shirt to his skin. The cabin emerged from the darkness like a shipwreck, tilted, weather-beaten but still intact. No lights showed from within, but Jake approached cautiously, alert for any movement. A soft nickering from the dilapidated lean-to beside the cabin confirmed his suspicions. Midnight Runner stood tethered inside, his sleek, black coat glistening. With raindrops, the horse recognized Jake, nudging his palm with the velvety muzzle. "Hey, boy," Jake whispered, running his hands down the animal's legs, checking for injuries. "Let's get you out of here. I wouldn't do that if I were you." Jake froze, recognizing Charlotte's voice immediately. She stepped from the cabin doorway, holding something that glinted metallic in the dim light. Not a gun, but the key he sought. "Give me one good reason not to call the sheriff right now," she said, twirling the small key between her fingers. "Breaking and entering horse theft. You're racking up quite the rap sheet, Cowboy." Jake straightened slowly, keeping his movements non-threatening. "Interesting accusation from the woman who stole my horse and ransacked my home." "Your horse?" Charlotte's laugh was brittle. "Everything on Harrington land belongs to the Harrington family, which, despite your little certificate, doesn't include you." "Then why go to all this trouble?" Jake gestured to the cabin, the hidden horse. "Why not just have Deputy Turner arrest me if I'm such a criminal?" Charlotte stepped closer, rain dripping from her expensive jacket. Unlike at the ranch, her carefully controlled appearance had slipped. Her hair hung in damp tendrils, and without perfect makeup she looked younger, more vulnerable, and somehow more dangerous. "Because I want to understand," she said, her voice lacking its usual sharp edge. "What did she tell you? What's so important that my grandmother would marry a stranger rather than trust her own family?" The genuine bewilderment in her tone caught Jake off guard. "You don't know?" "If I knew, would I be standing in a rotting cabin in the middle of a thunderstorm?" Lightning emphasized her words, illuminating her face in stark relief. For the first time, Jake saw past the polished facade to the confusion underneath. Charlotte wasn't just angry, she was hurt. "Your grandmother believes there are documents that would damage the Harrington name," Jake said carefully. "Something about Apache land and how your great-grandfather acquired the oil rights." Charlotte's expression shifted from surprise to realization to something like resignation. "The Broken Bow Massacre," she murmured almost to herself. "So that's what this is about. What massacre?" Instead of answering, Charlotte sank onto the cabin's decrepit porch steps, suddenly looking exhausted. "Family legend, one my father forbade mentioning. I only heard pieces from the staff when I was young. Something about how my great-grandfather James secured the original oil rights on land that belonged to the Apache." Jake remained by Midnight Runner, keeping the horse between them as a buffer. What happened? The official story is that James Harrington legally purchased land from the tribe in 1923. The unofficial story. She trailed off, twisting the key in her fingers. The unofficial story involves a night raid, a village burned, and tribal leaders who conveniently changed their minds about selling. The pieces clicked into place. "Your grandmother wants to make this public." It wasn't a question. "Which would destroy us," Charlotte confirmed, anger reigniting in her voice. "Not just our reputation, the legal ramifications would be catastrophic. The Apache Nation could claim rights to land worth billions. Harrington Oil would collapse overnight." "So Richard wants to destroy the evidence," Jake concluded. "And Eleanor wants to... what? Make amends." Charlotte's laugh held no humor. "My grandmother doesn't do amends. She does strategy. If she's collecting evidence about Broken Bow, it's because she's planning to control how the story comes out." Her eyes narrowed suspiciously. But why involve you? Why not just handle it through attorneys? The question had haunted Jake from the beginning. Why him? Why a desperate cowboy with nothing to offer but his name and his reputation? The answer hit him with the force of a physical blow. "Because I have nothing to lose," he said slowly, "and nothing to protect. I'm not a Harrington by blood. My reputation isn't tied to your family's past." "You'd be the perfect whistleblower," Charlotte realized, her expression darkening. The outsider who married in, discovered horrible secrets, and felt morally compelled to reveal them. The media would eat it up. Jake's stomach twisted. Was that all he was to Eleanor? A convenient puppet she could position as the face of whatever revelation she was planning. Why would Eleanor want to expose her own family? Destroy everything they've built? He asked. Charlotte's gaze drifted toward the rain-soaked darkness. "Grandmother always taught me that control is everything." Maybe she decided that controlling the narrative was better than waiting for someone else to discover the truth. She refocused on Jake, sudden intensity in her eyes. What exactly did her letter say? Jake hesitated. Despite everything, Eleanor's warning echoed in his mind. Trust no one. It mentioned the lockbox in Houston, said you and your father would destroy the documents. He watched her reaction carefully. It also said someone poisoned the cattle deliberately. Charlotte's expression registered genuine shock. Poisoned? Why would anyone? She stopped abruptly, comprehension dawning. The water rights, of course. What water rights? The Triple Creek Aquifer runs directly beneath this property. In a drought-prone region, whoever controls that water controls everything. Charlotte stood, brushing off her jeans with an absent gesture that betrayed her agitation. There's a conglomerate, Meridian Energy, that's been trying to buy access. For years. The same Meridian that wants to buy Harrington Oil, Jake noted, remembering Eleanor's question in the sunroom. They're not interested in our oil anymore. That's yesterday's fortune. Water is the future. Charlotte's voice took on a bitter edge. Grandmother has rejected every offer, no matter how astronomical. She says water rights should never be privatized. The pieces were assembling into a disturbing picture. So Meridian poisons Harrington cattle, creating a crisis that requires immediate attention, forcing Eleanor to find emergency management. Then they what? Hope to plant their own man in my position. Charlotte's eyes widened slightly. You think they were planning to manipulate her all along? That's actually plausible. Grandmother's illness has been an open secret in business circles. Everyone knows she's been searching for succession solutions. A crack of lightning split the sky, followed immediately by a thunderclap that shook the cabin's fragile structure. Midnight Runner whinnied nervously, pulling at his tether. "We need to get out of here," Jake said, reaching for the horse's reins. "This storm's getting worse." Charlotte made no move to stop him, but she clutched the key tighter. "What happens now, Cowboy? We race to Houston. You expose century-old crimes and destroy my family to fulfill your obligation to a woman you barely know." The question hung between them, heavy with implications. What did Jake owe Eleanor? A business arrangement had evolved into something far more complex, a moral quagmire with no clear path forward. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I do know that someone tried to frame me by stealing this horse and planting evidence. Someone poisoned your grandmother's cattle, and someone's desperate enough to cover up the past that they'd risk everything to stop the truth coming out." Charlotte studied him, calculation and uncertainty warring in her expression. Finally, she extended her hand, the key resting on her palm. "My father can't be involved in this," she said, her voice hardening. "Whatever grandmother's planning, whatever evidence exists about Broken Bow, I want to see it first, before any decisions are made." Jake eyed the key suspiciously. "Why the sudden cooperation?" "Because, contrary to what my grandmother thinks, I do care about more than money and failed fashion boutiques." Hurt flashed across her face. "This is still my family, my legacy. I deserve to know the truth before it's weaponized." The offer felt genuine, but Jake remembered Eleanor's emphatic warning. "And if the truth is worse than you imagine, if your great-grandfather did something unforgivable, then we deal with it like adults," Charlotte replied with sudden fierceness. "We make restitution, we acknowledge the past, but we do it on our terms, not as some deathbed revenge plot orchestrated by a woman who's always valued control over compassion." Her words struck a chord. Since meeting Eleanor, Jake had sensed the iron will that drove her, the calculating mind that saw people as pieces on a chessboard. Even her apparent moral stand regarding the family's past might simply be another power play. "Take the key," Charlotte urged, reading his hesitation. "Go to Houston, see what's in that lockbox, but promise me you'll call before you do anything with whatever you find." Jake stepped forward and accepted the small metal key, its weight insignificant compared to the responsibility it represented. "And your father? He seems less inclined to make amends." Charlotte's face hardened. "Let me worry about my father. Just get to Houston before Meridian realizes what's happening. If they're willing to poison cattle as a distraction, they won't hesitate to silence the man who could expose them." As if underscoring her warning, headlights appeared in the distance, bouncing along the rutted trail toward the cabin. "Were you followed?" Jake demanded, already untethering Midnight Runner. Charlotte's alarmed expression answered before her words could. "I was careful. No one knew." "Someone knew." Jake swung onto the horse's bare back, years of rodeo training making the movement fluid despite the rain and darkness. "Is there another way out of here?" Charlotte pointed toward the creek. "Follow it south. It connects to the old cattle trail that crosses the property line." The approaching vehicle was close enough now that its engine growled through the storm's din. Jake gathered the reins, then hesitated, looking down at Charlotte. "You coming or staying?" For a moment, she seemed torn, princess of the Harrington Empire versus fugitive in a storm. Then practicality won out. "Go," she urged. "I'll claim I came looking for the horse myself. They won't hurt me. I'm family." Jake nodded once, then spurred Midnight Runner toward the creek. The powerful horse responded instantly, surging forward into the rain-swept darkness. Behind them, voices shouted and a car door slammed. As they plunged into the swollen creek, Jake clutched the key in one hand and the reins in the other, the cold water shocking his system into heightened awareness. Whatever waited in that Houston lockbox had better be worth the danger it had unleashed. Eleanor had entrusted him with her deadly secrets, but she hadn't trusted him with the whole truth. As Midnight Runner scrambled up the far bank, Jake made a silent vow. Once he uncovered what lay beneath the Harrington legacy, he would make his own decisions about justice, redemption, and the price of truth. The horse's powerful strides carried them away from pursuit, each hoofbeat a counterpoint to the thunder overhead. Jake bent low over Midnight's neck, rain lashing his face. The key to everything clutched in his fist. Houston was 4 hours away by car, longer by rural back roads, avoiding highways where Richard's influence might have alerted authorities. But Jake had to reach the city before Eleanor's strength failed completely, before whatever force had targeted the cattle and pursued him tonight caught up with their quarry. Because now Jake understood what Eleanor had meant in her cryptic final words in the hospital. Redemption sometimes requires sacrifice. The question wasn't whether Jake would expose the Harrington family secrets. The question was what and who would be sacrificed in the process, and whether Jake himself would survive to see the truth finally laid bare.